and welcome to another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me, as always, is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm full of giggles now because that was very creative.
I figured I might make that work. I don't know.
No, I'm good. I'm good, man. How are you doing?
I'm zooming right now.
Yes. So we are. We're going to talk about dealing with gaps in audio and not glitches and things, although, as we'll discover, there probably could be. But how to keep listeners' interest by employing space and also other ideas of how to kind of creatively fill those
holes. Fixing a hole.
Fixing a hole, just like the Beatles song.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're dealing with spaces in audio. And as I not so eloquently tried to explain there, we're not just talking about silence here, but as you demonstrated in the intro here, silence can be a great way to keep somebody's interest because you go, what was that?
If you know the normal intro, of course.
Right. That would be the assumption, right? But I'm thinking of space now in this sense of where the melody, whatever that is, if it's an instrument or the vocal, which would be the most common case, when that is not the focus, then that's not the present. How do we make that section of a song interesting?
Mm-hmm. You say in the silent part, I have $1,000 for the first listener to respond to this silent part. That will keep them interested in a hurry.
Probably would, but then you'll end up with a bunch of lawsuits and stuff when you don't pass out that kind of money. Or otherwise, they call that payola. Now,
sure.
When we're dealing with music and songs, and this is obviously very style dependent to me, because if you're coming from a jazz bebop background or you're dealing with some more progressive or even ambient types of music, these rules may not apply to you. I would argue that when we're writing songs generally, it is our job to hopefully capture the listener's interest for the duration of the song. Mm-hmm. Now, on the flip side of that, do you think it's okay to actually lose the listener at some point?
You mentioned there are cases where it doesn't matter so much. And I'd be willing to bet those musicians would still think it matters. But the reality is, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? In short pop songs, the shorter it is, the less likely you should be losing the listener's attention. If you've got a song that's going 15 minutes to an hour long, you're probably not going to capture the entire intent moment of full focus.
This is true. I remember an interview with Jeff Tate from Queensryche. At the time, he was still in Queensryche. He was discussing the songwriting methods of him and the other primary songwriter, Chris DeGarmo, where Chris was very much in the camp that, no, we can't lose the listener. We got to keep this interesting for the duration of the song. And I would say, like, Queensryche is probably sort of like semi-proggy to some people, so there were some excursions going out. Whereas Jeff, he was like, no, I'm totally fine with losing the focus of the listener as long as we can get it back and capture it within the same song. So it's different mindsets, right? But I think that's a pretty ballsy thing. So
that's confidence, I guess.
Yeah.
To an extent. I think it's harder to keep the listener's interest.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot, especially today, I would argue. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, we see songs getting shorter and shorter just because attention spans are shorter at this point. So how do we go about keeping the listener's attention to our song? And I would argue also that this is very much an arrangement thing. Right?
I would concur with that. A lot of it has to do with how a song is arranged.
Right. Another one of those like sort of psychology things that I've heard, and I believe it to be true, is that the average listener will be able to pay attention to at most 3 things at a time.
Well, that puts really all those like 5-part bands out of business, doesn't it?
Well, Yes and no, but I mean, because most people, you feel the groove, right? You generally pay attention to the singer or the melody line, and then possibly something else. You're hearing everything, but are you really focusing on it?
Right.
Because, I mean, that's something that, we all listen to. Oh, my God, I never heard that bass line before, whatever it is. Never paid attention to it because it might be hidden in a part, and it's just your attention is drawn to other things.
Yeah.
The old joke was that for a lot of like early rock and metal stuff, right? And Geezer Butler will have to accept my apology here, but it's like most people would argue that you take the bass out and nobody really cares.
Oof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they tried it with Injustice for All, but anyway, that's a bad example. Actually, it's a great example for this case. The focus is just there primarily on three things. How do we use that knowing that we can't have everything being the focal point at all times?
I would look at it per section. And in each section, something needs a particular focal point. In the chorus, a lot of the times, it's the lead vocal. And one could argue that it should be the lead vocal throughout the entire song. Then you're left with two other things. It really depends on what kind of stuff you have surrounding your vocal, if it's a vocal-oriented track. If it's an instrumental, is there a particular instrumentalist per section that needs to be highlighted? That I would look at what is the focal point for the particular parts in a given section and determine which ones are the most important at that point in time.
I would absolutely agree with that, Jody. I think what we perhaps should clarify, though, at least from my view, is that the parts that are not the main parts, they can still be interesting. It's just that you have to realize that people might not notice all of them at the same time. So it's the same thing when a mix comes together. Like I like to say that a mix is not a democracy. Not everything gets equal importance in the mix, right? In the hierarchy, something is going to take focus. It is an arrangement thing, but other things that we can do as well is like in those parts, right? So let's say that there's a vocal line and there will inevitably be a break in the vocal or the melody, right? What do we do in there that keeps the listener's interest? If it's like a guitar-based song or a keyboard-based song, doesn't matter, is the part that is playing underneath the vocal, is that interesting enough to carry the listener through to that part, to the next section when the singer comes back in again?
Right.
It's thinking about those little bits. But other things that we can do, obviously, is like create a contrast there. It could be changing up a part, adding something, adding a different sound, something to come in to kind of create contrast.
You're talking when you repeat a particular section. So like the first verse might have one concept to its mix and the second verse might have a alternate context to its mix, in that maybe a guitar part is super prominent in the first verse and a keyboard part might be super prominent in the second verse.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be things like that. Or I'm also thinking about a common trick is there's a different guitar figure that comes in perhaps in the second verse, just to kind of elevate that some more and to kind of keep the interest. And perhaps little lines in between vocals and things, just something that is happening. And I think that's something you learn when you start writing, to do complementary parts. That you're not stepping all over the vocal, but you're perhaps filling holes instead that are left from the melody. All of these things that we're talking about, like coming up with new parts, it doesn't mean that a break can't also be a really good way to kind of grab the listener.
And you mean silence, by the way.
Actual silence, yeah. So, I mean, the whole common thing is like there's a 1 or 2 beat break before a chorus, right? So you have that massive drop and you kind of left hanging like, whoa, what was that? And then, boom, we're coming back in with a chorus. And it's like, now you have everybody's attention again. That is a really, really cool trick also to do. What do you do? Other things besides those little things that you like to introduce to keep the interest?
One of the biggest things that I do, or the most common current thing that I do, is using an odd bar of time or an extra bar of time.
Yeah, that's
like
something.
A bar of 5, a bar of 7, a bar of 6, or an extra measure of section is just ended and you let it hang for a moment. Usually I will do an odd bar so that it's not a full 4 count, or if it's a typical 4/4 pop song, I will add a bar of 5 or a bar of 7 just to give it something different.
Yeah, that's something that I have definitely stolen from you. When you brought that up. Because it is really, really effective. Mm-hmm. For me, the way you do it is like, here's the blueprint, right? But if you're coming out or going into a breakdown section or something, mm-hmm. and you want to introduce something new, it's primarily for me, it's like kind of going into the last chorus after a breakdown or something. You have perhaps that break of 1 bar, add another beat to that. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's another 5, or even shortened it down. Now, it's technically not 3/4, it's not an odd meter. Let's say instead of odd, let's say unusual time signature, right, for that mm-hmm. song. So shortening a breakdown, that will take you by surprise, or anything that will kind of just like, oh, something felt weird. And I think unless you're a musician and you're feeling the pulse and you have a tendency to just kind of count measures, you might not notice exactly what's happening, but it certainly is effective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do have an example in my past where there was a constant change to the break that happened over the course of the song. And every single time it was removing a 16th of a note from the measure. So
this is during your proggy time, I guess. Yeah.
The first one had a removal of a 16th. The second one, it was an 8th note. The next one, it was 3/16, which was a little different. And it changed the makeup of it. Of course, it makes it a little bit more difficult to count it. You just normally have to just feel it.
Yeah.
But another thing that's very effective is coming up with an additional synth line or keyboard part or guitar riff, or even a vocal riff for that matter, where you can just shove it into the corner of this empty space and be like, here's a little extra piece of musical melodic ear candy for you.
Yeah. I want to go back to the break thing there, though, and ask you, was that something that came to you from doing a bunch of production music? Because a lot of times music supers would like to have a break point in there so that they can make easier edits. Mm-hmm. Was that something that came from that, or was that something else?
Nope, entirely different. It was...
Okay, forget I asked.
No, I get where you're coming with that, and production music does make a very easy way to just say, hey, this is everything should start and end on an actual downbeat so that it's very easy to edit. In terms of what I was talking about with removing a 16th note on a particular section each time it hit it, and it only hits it 3 times in the song over the course of the song. So first time it's removing a 16th. The second time, as I said, 2/16, which is an 8th. And then the third time it's 3/16, which is 3/16. It was more the homage to the genre that the song was in, and a tip of the hat to those prog rock type bands that I don't think necessarily ever did that, but were capable of doing that. Mm-hmm. That's where
so you're
it
talking
came
like
from.
Genesis or Rush or any
things
of those
that
kind of
nature,
things.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting because it is one of those things that when you can't get a transition to work, it's sometimes a nice toolbox to kind of pull out. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, let's shorten out this break or let's extend this break. And even if it's just a little bit, you can very easily overdo it.
Yes.
But it can be remarkably effective when you get it right. What about something else that we've talked about in those spaces, something I like to call like production candy?
Mm-hmm. Well, as we were talking just before hitting record, there's a song that the original version was a little bit more difficult to pull off by adding this reverb on a particular word on a vocal. Mm. In this day and age now, it's substantially easier. And the idea that I'm talking about is just taking this word from a vocal line, and sending it to a reverb channel that is all by itself, so that when it hits that word at that point in the song and there's a break that's happening, what's carrying out over the break is the reverb value of what was sung just before that. And if you set it up for dramatic effect, it can carry for the entire break length or more or less if you want. In the particular instance, as it was originally done, it started in mono when it's first sung, and as the reverb tails out, it blooms out into stereo by using an automation on the pan knobs. And that's an interesting technique. You don't really hear that done a lot.
Yeah, it's one of those things that if you're just casually listening as well, you might get that something is happening, but it's even more ear candy when you're doing it. It's a very effective way, and it's having that big, lush reverb just coming out on a word and just kind of carrying through. So that's a nice little ear candy. I used to do a similar esque type of a thing in breaks and things where, as opposed to doing like just a straight up delay throw, we can have like you put a certain word in delay and have it echo through. I would often, and I still do actually, take that word and copy it to a new track, and sometimes multiple tracks depending on how many repeats I want. So now I get complete control of not only when the delay is hitting, but also how it's going to sound. So now I can apply whatever I want to each delay, right, or to each echo, place it wherever I want without having to use a ridiculous amount of automation, and also EQ differently, treat it differently, like so maybe add distortion to it or completely obliterate it or whatever. That's a nice technique I like to do, again, to just kind of keep people's interest to filling a space, as it were, as we're talking about that today.
Another one that I've recently used is on a drum sound, where you might have a simple flammed snare that leads into the next section. And what I did on a particular flammed snare for that as a fill is ran the snare to a bus that had bit crushing type of delay to it.
Nice.
So you get this thwack that is the flam of the snare, and then you get a thwack, thwack, happening behind it, but it's distorted in a funky way due to the bit crusher, because it doesn't distort the same way as a normal fuzz distortion would, and gets you a rather different sound to the drums in that regard, which is something that might make a listener go,
Yeah. And sometimes, of course, those little production candies become like an integral part of the song. Now, I'm thinking about also one thing that I used to do a lot more than I do today, but I still like the technique, and it's the use of stutter edits.
Right.
And
the man, the myth, the legend, BT.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly when it came on my radar. One of the most creative uses of that, I think, was a song called Battle Flag by Low Fidelity All-Stars. What they had done, they had some bad words had to be taken out for the radio edit.
Sure.
But what they did was that they had that, and they took the transient of said word and made it into a stutter.
Oh.
To me, that became, oh my God, that's an amazing hook, the way they just dealt with that in a very creative way. So much so, as a matter of fact, when I heard the uncensored version the first time, I was like, this is not as cool. But using stutters and things are also a great way of just like production can do, just like adding points of interest into our song. There's a really good example of this in the metal world in early 2010s, I want to say 2012. The band In This Moment have a song called Blood. If you're unfamiliar with that, go listen to that, because that is like a case study in using stutter edits in like a metal realm. And it sounds really, really, really cool. It's almost like, oh, this should be a demo track for stutter edit. I'm not sure if it was done by hand or actually used by stutter edit, but it was Ken or Kevin Shirko. I can't recall who it was that did that. But that's a really, really cool example of those.
Right on.
Yeah. Another use of switching gears here quite drastically, of using a delay to keep interest, is Pink Floyd, Us and Them.
That song, yes.
Because it has those delay echoes that kind of keep the gap. And it could have been just the vocal, right? Us, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and them. Right. But filling that space up with delay where a whole lot of stuff is not necessarily happening, but it becomes really, really effective.
Just using a delay.
Yeah, fancy that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the whole concept here and anything, it sounds absurd when we're talking about creating parts and things to keep interest, but going back all the way to like Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good.
That's a prime example of filling up a spot with a guitar riff and then singing something and then filling it up with more guitar riff and then singing something more.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds really, really simple when you point it out, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a case study, and it works really, really well for that. Another one that I'm thinking about that's really, really well arranged and really sparse at the same time is the Nine Inch Nails track Satellite off of Hesitation Marks. It's not a huge hit or anything like that, but if you listen to that, the sparseness of that production and how there's sort of these points of interest, synth lines coming in and out of the vocal, I think it's just impeccable. Mm.
One thing I would like to point out after all of the stuff that we've just expelled in this episode is that the idea of the ear candy or the production tricks of filling a hole or using silence are nifty ideas to help, as we mentioned at the very beginning, keep a listener's interest. What I don't think they are is a substitute for the difference between what is a song that might be meh and a song that is an absolute banging hit. I've seen people say things on the internet to that effect of like, if your production isn't the most top-notch of top-notch, it's never going to be a hit. That's a load of shit. The song itself can be a hit regardless of the production. I've heard guitar and vocal demos that will just floor you because they're so goddamn good. And I've heard massively overproduced EDM tracks that are just junk because every trick in the book has been kitchen sinked into it and it just doesn't work. It's a very fine line to make that distinction in a sense of saying this production trick will make or break the song. Can a production trick help it? Yes. Can it hinder it? Yes. Should it make a song a hit? No. That would be my opinion of that.
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with that. We have to take a step back, and when we're talking about this, it's like it's just to keep the interest of the listener, things that we might consider when we're arranging the song. This is not a make or break song thing. Like you said, the song itself should stand on its own two legs, right? All the production candy in the world is not going to help a crappy song. It might polish the proverbial turd, right? But yes. But yeah, if you don't have a good song, it's not a good song. It doesn't matter how many bells and whistles you have. And also the trap of falling into that you need all these bells and whistles for it to be a good song is nonsense, because you really don't. I like to use the expression like there are songs that sound like a Vegas casino, when there's like noises and stuff going on everywhere, and it's distracting. It's finding the balance there, having a good arrangement, and then little points of interest that guide the listener. And it could be simple stuff, right? We mentioned Johnny Be Good, or listen to any AC/DC song.
Or a Lady Gaga tune, for that matter. She's the queen of just little bits and pieces of constantly having every section be super interesting and hooky, for that matter.
Yeah.
She's amazing at it.
Absolutely.
Same with Sia.
It's used with caution, right?
Yeah. Let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, I've been talking about my use of delay here in certain cases. So I have another delay. It's the Native Instruments Replica XT, which is fantastic delay, I think. It has a couple of algorithms in there that I think are really, really cool because it's not just a straight digital delay. It has different modes of it. It's not an emulation of anything in the sense that it actually does have it like a tape echo in there as well. It's a really cool delay. It's really functional. It's not very expensive. It doesn't try to sound like a 2290 or an Eventide or anything like that, but it is a really, really cool delay. So that is my Friday find this week, the Native Instruments Replica XT. And Jody, what have you got?
Isotope has recently announced the update to RX11. Personally, I have RX11 Advanced already. I'm just that kind of guy. I will say this. If you are in need of restoration or fixing some kind of voice thing, the new version is finally getting to a point where it's like, holy cow, you may not need 10 different plugins and 11 different steps to clean up a particular piece of audio. And the reason why I say that is I do have an interview that was originally done on micro cassette from like across the room of where both people were speaking as my reference point of testing things of this nature. And while it's still not perfect on it for a singular step to make it audible, it is very, very close to that point. It works substantially better than RX10. Not to mention that they've made improvements to the stem module to RX, which is the music rebalance thing. That is getting better and better as a lot of people are now talking about taking 2-track stereo things and turning them back into stems, a la like Logic with its new version doing it. I am going with RX11 for this week.
Cool. I haven't tried 11 out yet, but I do a fair bit of work in RX, and I'm excited to kind of try it out because even 10 that I'm working with does wonders for a lot of stuff. And if they can bump that up another couple of steps with 11, I'll be a happy camper.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list to be eligible for future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this insanely cool podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word holes, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Have a good one, Jody. Thanks for listening, everybody.